Welcome back to Real Life Documentary. Please support us by liking our videos and subscribing to our channel. Now to today's episode on Real Life Documentary. Octavia and Oscar Fairweather's love story began like a fairy tale. They first met as undergraduates at Creekside College, where Octavia majored in art and Oscar pursued a business administration degree. Oscar was immediately drawn to Octavia when he saw her by the campus lake. Tall, charismatic, and with a captivating smile, Oscar charmed Octavia with his ambition and charm. They married soon after graduation, eager to build a life together in their hometown. Octavia became a beloved art teacher at a local high school, known for her creativity and dedication to nurturing young talent. Meanwhile, Oscar, leveraging his family connections, secured a position at a prestigious local investment firm and quickly ascended the corporate ladder. Over the years, the Fairweathers established themselves as prominent members of the Creekside community. They were regulars at galas and town council meetings, and their home in Oakwood Estates, purchased with Oscar's growing wealth, became a symbol of their success. Octavia's artistic flair was evident throughout their home, from the hand-painted murals in the living room to the carefully selected sculptures in the backyard. To the outside world, Octavia and Oscar seemed like the perfect couple. They complemented each other well. Octavia's creativity balanced Oscar's business savvy, and her warmth softened his occasionally stern demeanor. Friends often commented on how they still looked at each other with the same affection they had in college. However, beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life, there were subtle tensions that hinted at underlying challenges. Octavia and Oscar had been struggling to conceive for years, and the emotional toll of fertility treatments and repeated disappointments began to strain their relationship. Oscar coped by immersing himself in his work, often spending long hours at the office, while Octavia sought comfort in her art and her students. During this difficult period, Octavia's bond with her mother, Cordelia Prescott, grew stronger and became a crucial source of support. Cordelia, a widow who lived on the outskirts of town, had always been a free spirit. In her younger years, she traveled the world as a photojournalist, eventually settling in Creekside after meeting Octavia's father. After his death, Cordelia retreated into a quieter life, focusing on her garden and volunteering at the local animal shelter. As Octavia spent more time with her mother, Oscar found himself increasingly drawn into Cordelia's presence as well. What started as polite conversation during family dinners gradually deepened into something more, setting the stage for a betrayal that would ultimately shatter the Fairweather family. The seeds of the affair between Oscar and Cordelia were planted on a crisp autumn evening when Octavia was preoccupied with preparing for an upcoming art exhibition featuring her students' work. Feeling neglected and frustrated by the growing distance in his marriage, Oscar decided to visit Cordelia's cottage alone, ostensibly to check on his mother-in-law. Cordelia, surprised but pleased by the unexpected visit, greeted Oscar with a warm smile and a glass of her homemade wine. As they sat together in her small, cluttered living room, surrounded by eclectic souvenirs from her travels, Oscar found himself opening up about his marital troubles. Cordelia listened with empathy, her eyes, so similar to Octavia's, full of understanding. Perhaps it was the wine, the intimate atmosphere, or simply a deep need for human connection, but that night, a line was crossed. A comforting touch lingered too long, and a gaze held more meaning than it should have. By the time Oscar left Cordelia's cottage, both knew that something had changed irreversibly. In the weeks that followed, Oscar and Cordelia found excuses to see each other. Cordelia suddenly needed help with home repairs, while Oscar developed a newfound interest in gardening. Their secret meetings became more frequent, always carefully timed to avoid raising suspicion. During one of their early encounters, Oscar arrived at Cordelia's cottage to help fix a leaky faucet. As they worked side by side in the cramped space of her bathroom, the air between them grew thick with unspoken tension. Their hands brushed accidentally, sending electric shocks through both of them. When Cordelia reached past Oscar for a towel, he caught the scent of her perfume, a heady mix of jasmine and vanilla, that made his head swim. Their eyes met in the mirror, and for a moment, neither could look away. On a warm Sunday afternoon, Cordelia was showing Oscar how to prune her rose bushes. As she demonstrated the technique, standing close behind him to guide his hands, both were acutely aware of their physical proximity. The gentle brush of her breath on his neck and the warmth of her body against his back sent shivers down Oscar's spine. When he turned to ask a question, their faces were just inches apart. Time seemed to stand still as Oscar and Cordelia found themselves frozen in a moment of forbidden desire. During a rare moment alone at a family gathering, they slipped away to the edge of the garden behind the house, hidden from view by a trellis covered in climbing roses. There, they gave in to their desires, kisses urgent, hands roaming with a desperation born from the fleeting nature of their stolen moments. When they heard Octavia's voice calling for them, they quickly pulled apart, hastily straightening their clothes and hair. The guilt was immediate, but so was the thrill of their secret affair, adding a dangerous excitement to their illicit encounters. Their affair consumed them, blinding them to the consequences of their actions. In Cordelia's bedroom, once a space for solitary nights, they created a world of secret passion. The creak of bed springs and hushed whispers became the soundtrack of their illicit love, playing out against the backdrop of familial betrayal. As their physical intimacy deepened, so did their emotional entanglement. What had begun as a mere physical attraction evolved into something far more complex and dangerous. They started to imagine a future together, heedless of the devastation such dreams could bring to their family. This combination of physical passion and emotional connection would ultimately lead to their downfall. In whispered conversations, they justified their actions. Oscar spoke of feeling unappreciated and misunderstood by Octavia, while Cordelia confessed to a deep loneliness that had haunted her since her husband's death. Oscar and Cordelia convinced themselves that their connection was unique, something that transcended the boundaries of conventional relationships. As their affair deepened, so did their web of lies. Oscar began to invent business trips and late meetings, while Cordelia feigned illness to avoid family gatherings. They communicated through a secret email account and disposable phones, always careful to cover their tracks. But with each deception, the weight of guilt grew heavier. Oscar found it increasingly difficult to look Octavia in the eye, and Cordelia's interactions with her daughter became strained and awkward. The relationship that had once been Octavia's source of comfort was now tainted by betrayal. Neither Oscar nor Cordelia could have foreseen the devastating consequences their actions would have on the entire Fairweather family. As they continued their illicit liaison, they remained oblivious to the suspicions beginning to form in Octavia's mind. The first sign that something was amiss came to Octavia on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. She had decided to surprise Oscar with lunch at his office, only to be told by his confused secretary that he had left early for a meeting with a client. Octavia brushed it off as a miscommunication, but a seed of doubt had been planted. Over the following weeks, Octavia began to notice subtle changes in Oscar's behavior. He became more distracted, often lost in thought during their conversations. His phone would buzz at odd hours, and he would step out of the room to take calls in hushed tones. When questioned, Oscar dismissed her concerns with vague explanations about work stress and important deals in the pipeline. Octavia's artistic sensitivity, which had always been a source of joy, now became a curse as she started noticing details that others might have missed. She picked up on the faint scent of unfamiliar perfume on Oscar's clothes, a lipstick smudge on a coffee mug he brought home from the office, and the way he sometimes avoided her touch. These observations accumulated in her mind, forming a picture she desperately didn't want to see. Her relationship with her mother, Cordelia, also began to change. Once eager to spend time with her daughter, Cordelia now seemed distant and preoccupied. Their weekly tea sessions became less frequent, with Cordelia often canceling at the last minute, citing various commitments. When they did meet, Octavia sensed a nervousness in her mother's demeanor and a reluctance to meet her eyes, which was completely out of character. As her suspicions grew, Octavia found herself trapped in a spiral of doubt and self-recrimination. She questioned every interaction, analyzed every word spoken by Oscar and Cordelia, wondering if she was imagining things. Was the stress of their fertility struggles and her upcoming exhibition making her paranoid? Determined to find the truth, Octavia began to investigate discreetly. She checked Oscar's credit card statements, noting several charges at restaurants and hotels that he had never mentioned. She even drove by her mother's cottage at odd hours, her heart sinking when she spotted Oscar's car parked down the street on an evening when he was supposedly working late. Each new piece of evidence felt like a physical blow, chipping away at the foundation of trust that had been the bedrock of her life. Octavia's students and colleagues noticed the change in her demeanor. Dark circles formed under her eyes, her hands trembled as she demonstrated brush techniques, and her smile, once warm and genuine, now seemed forced, never quite reaching her eyes. As the days passed, the weight of her suspicions and the unraveling of her once stable world became impossible to ignore. Octavia became a shadow of her former self, torn between confronting her fears and clinging to the last shreds of hope that she was mistaken. Little did she know that the truth, when it finally came to light, would be even more devastating than she could have imagined. The day Octavia's world shattered began like any other. It was a Saturday, and she had spent the morning at the school, putting the finishing touches on the student art exhibition. Oscar had left early, mumbling something about a golf game with clients. As Octavia drove home, her mind preoccupied with last-minute details for the upcoming show, she decided on a whim to stop by her mother's cottage. Perhaps a cup of tea and a chat would help calm her nerves. As Octavia turned onto the quiet lane leading to Cordelia's home, her heart nearly stopped. There, parked outside, was Oscar's sleek black sedan. For a moment, Octavia sat in her car, hands gripping the steering wheel. She told herself there could be an innocent explanation, but deep down, she knew. With trembling legs, Octavia approached the cottage. The curtains were drawn, but through a small gap, she could see movement inside. Taking a deep breath, she used her key to unlock the door, pushing it open as quietly as possible. The sight that greeted her would be forever seared into her memory. There, on the floral-patterned couch, Oscar and Cordelia were locked in an intimate embrace, oblivious to the world around them. Cordelia's hair was disheveled, and Oscar's shirt was partially unbuttoned. On the coffee table, 2 half-empty wine glasses stood as mute witnesses to their betrayal. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, as if sensing her presence, Oscar and Cordelia looked up, their expressions shifting from surprise to horror as they realized they had been caught. The expressions on their faces, shock, guilt, and a flicker of defiance, were burned into Octavia's memory. What followed was a blur of emotions and accusations. Octavia's anguished cry shattered the silence, startling the guilty pair. Oscar jumped to his feet, stammering out excuses and pleas, while Cordelia remained seated, her face ashen, tears streaming down her cheeks. Octavia, her voice raw with pain and fury, hurled questions at them. The answers, when they came, were like daggers to her heart. 6 months, it had started as a friendship and then evolved into something more. They hadn't meant for it to happen. They were sorry. But their apologies did nothing to soothe the searing betrayal Octavia felt. Unable to bear their presence any longer, Octavia fled the cottage. She drove aimlessly for hours, her mind replaying the scene over and over again. By the time she returned home, the sun had set, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn of the house she had once considered her sanctuary. As she sat in the darkened living room, surrounded by the trappings of her seemingly perfect life, Octavia felt something inside her break. The pain, the betrayal, the sheer magnitude of the deception, it was all too much. In that moment, a cold resolve began to form in her heart. Someone would have to pay for this betrayal, and Octavia knew exactly who that someone would be. The events leading up to the fatal shooting unfolded over several tense hours on that warm summer evening. Octavia, having spent the day in a haze of grief and anger, found herself pacing the halls of her home like a caged animal. The tick of the clock in the foyer seemed to mock her, counting down the moments until her world would irrevocably change. As dusk fell, Oscar returned home. He entered cautiously, his usual confident stride replaced by hesitant steps. Octavia watched from the shadows of the dining room as he hung up his jacket and loosened his tie, her heart pounding as the moment of confrontation approached. The familiar routine was now tainted by the knowledge of Oscar's betrayal. When he called out Octavia's name, his voice was strained with apprehension. As she stepped into the light, he visibly flinched. The woman standing before him bore little resemblance to the vibrant, loving wife he had once known. Octavia's eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, her posture rigid with barely contained fury. Oscar, his face a mask of guilt and desperation, launched into a litany of excuses and apologies. He spoke of feeling neglected, of the pressures of work and their fertility struggles. He claimed the affair had been a mistake, a moment of weakness that had spiraled out of control. But with each word, Octavia felt her anger rising, a tide of rage threatening to overwhelm her. Without fully realizing what she was doing, Octavia found herself walking to Oscar's study. She knew he kept a handgun in the desk drawer, a precaution he had insisted on after a series of break-ins in the neighborhood. As if in a trance, she retrieved the weapon, feeling its cold weight in her hand. When she returned to the living room, Oscar's eyes widened in shock and fear. He raised his hands, backing away slowly, his words now coming in a panicked rush. He promised to end the affair, to go to counseling, to do whatever it took to save their marriage. But Octavia barely heard him. In her mind, she saw only images of Oscar and Cordelia together, their betrayal playing on an endless loop. What happened next was a blur of motion and sound. Oscar lunged forward, perhaps trying to disarm her, but in that moment of chaos and heightened emotion, everything spiraled out of control. Octavia's finger tightened on the trigger. The gunshot was deafening in the confined space, followed by an eerie silence broken only by the tinkling of shattered glass from a fallen picture frame. Oscar staggered backward, his face a mask of disbelief as he pressed his hand to his chest. Blood seeped between his fingers, staining his crisp white shirt crimson. He collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, his eyes locked on Octavia in a silent plea. As the reality of what she had done crashed over her, Octavia dropped the gun, its clatter on the hardwood floor jolting her from her shocked state. She rushed to Oscar's side, her anger instantly replaced by horror and regret. Pressing her hands against the wound, she desperately tried to stem the flow of blood. Oscar's breathing grew labored, his skin growing pale. With trembling hands, Octavia reached for her phone and dialed 911, her voice shaking as she gave the dispatcher their address and pleaded for an ambulance to hurry. As she waited for help to arrive, she cradled Oscar's head in her lap, whispering a mixture of apologies and pleas for him to hold on. The next few minutes felt like an eternity. Neighbors, alerted by the gunshot, began to gather outside. Through the window, Octavia saw curious faces peering in, their expressions shifting from concern to shock as they took in the scene. She heard muffled voices and someone shouting about calling the police. When the paramedics finally arrived, they worked swiftly to stabilize Oscar. Octavia, numb with shock, watched as they loaded him onto a stretcher and rushed him to the waiting ambulance. As the sirens faded into the distance, Octavia was left alone in the darkness of the living room, the weight of her actions and the shattering of her world settling in around her. Octavia found herself alone in the house, surrounded by the aftermath of her actions. It wasn't long before the police arrived. Detective Mia Davis took charge of the scene, her keen eyes taking in every detail as officers secured the area and began collecting evidence. Detective Davis approached Octavia, who sat motionless on the blood-stained couch. In a gentle but firm voice, she informed Octavia of her rights and asked if she understood what had happened. Octavia, her voice barely audible, recounted the events of the day, the discovery of the affair, the confrontation, and the moment the gun went off. Throughout her statement, she seemed almost detached, as if she were describing something that had happened to someone else. As Octavia was led away in handcuffs, the gravity of the situation began to sink in. She caught glimpses of her neighbors watching from behind hastily drawn curtains, their faces a mix of horror and fascination. At General Hospital, Oscar Fairweather clung to life in the intensive care unit. The bullet had missed his heart by mere inches, lodging dangerously close to his spine. He underwent multiple surgeries as a steady stream of colleagues and family friends visited, their hushed conversations in the waiting room filled with speculation and disbelief. Cordelia Prescott, racked with guilt and shame, attempted to visit her son-in-law but was turned away by the Fairweather family. She retreated to her cottage, refusing to answer calls or open her door. The weight of her role in the tragedy seemed to age her overnight, her once vibrant demeanor replaced by a haunted, hollow-eyed look. Detective Davis, meanwhile, delved deeper into the case. She interviewed friends, colleagues, and family members, piecing together the events that had led to that fateful night. The more she uncovered about the Fairweather family's history and the affair between Oscar and Cordelia, the more complex and disturbing the case became. As the investigation progressed, the case grew more complex. What had initially been seen as a straightforward case of attempted murder in a fit of rage revealed itself as a tragedy born of betrayal and shattered trust. The town of Creekside found itself divided, with some sympathizing with Octavia's plight while others condemned her actions as inexcusable. One of the most crucial pieces of evidence came from an unexpected source, Octavia's best friend and fellow art teacher, Zara. Zara came forward with a series of text messages from the weeks leading up to the shooting. In these messages, Octavia had confided her growing suspicions about Oscar and Cordelia, detailing the signs of infidelity she had noticed. The messages provided a window into Octavia's emotional turmoil and her struggle to confront the truth, offering valuable insight into her state of mind. Inside the packed courtroom, the air was thick with tension as the judge called the proceedings to order. The prosecution, led by the ambitious district attorney Vincent Harding, painted Octavia as a vengeful woman who had committed a premeditated act of violence. Harding argued that the shooting was not a crime of passion but a calculated attempt to punish both her husband and her mother for their betrayal. In contrast, Octavia's defense team, headed by a seasoned attorney, presented a different narrative. They portrayed Octavia as a victim of circumstances, a woman pushed to the brink by an unthinkable betrayal. They argued that her actions, while tragic, were the result of intense emotional distress and not premeditated malice. Morales, Octavia's defense attorney, emphasized her impeccable character, her contributions to the community, and the extreme emotional distress she had been under at the time of the shooting. In their closing arguments, both the prosecution and defense made impassioned pleas to the jury. Vincent Harding, the district attorney, stressed the seriousness of the crime and the need for justice, while Morales urged the jury to consider the extraordinary circumstances and Octavia's otherwise exemplary life. As the jury filed out to begin their deliberations, a hush fell over the courtroom. The fate of Octavia Fairweather now rested in their hands, and with it, the resolution of a tragedy that had shaken Creekside to its core. After 3 days of intense deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Octavia Fairweather was found guilty of aggravated assault, a lesser charge than the attempted murder the prosecution had sought. The courtroom erupted in a mix of gasps and murmurs as the verdict was read. Octavia stood stoically beside her attorney. Taking into account Octavia's previously unblemished record and the extraordinary circumstances of the case, the judge sentenced her to 5 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 3 years. Additionally, Octavia was mandated to undergo psychological counseling and complete an anger management program. The sentence was met with mixed reactions from the community. Some felt it was too lenient given the severity of the crime, while others believed it struck an appropriate balance between justice and compassion. As Octavia was led away from the courtroom, the full weight of her actions and the long road ahead seemed to settle heavily on her shoulders. Oscar, having recovered from his physical wounds but forever changed by the experience, had relocated to a different state to start anew. He and Octavia had divorced during her incarceration, with their communication limited to formal letters and occasional phone calls. Despite the pain of their shared past, there was a tentative forgiveness between them, born of mutual understanding and regret. Cordelia had retreated from public life entirely, living as a virtual recluse in her cottage. Her only contact with the outside world was the occasional visit from a home health aide. The weight of her role in the tragedy had taken a severe toll on her health and spirit. As Creekside slowly healed and life moved forward, the story of Octavia, Oscar, and Cordelia remained a powerful reminder of how quickly and irrevocably lives can change. It challenges us to examine our own relationships, value the trust placed in us by our loved ones, and consider the far-reaching impacts of our choices.